Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give folks a few minutes to join the webinar, so we'll get started in a few minutes. Thanks everyone for joining. We're just giving folks a few minutes to jump on. So we'll get started shortly. Just give it one more minute. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining. Okay. I think we are ready to go. Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to have everyone join us for this amazing webinar that you're about to experience. I want to just thank you all for joining, for taking the time out of your day to be with us and share in this experience. My name is Gina Peralta, and I am a program officer with the Heising Simons Foundation's Human Rights Program. And I'm also one of the co-chairs for the California, excuse me, California Criminal Justice Funders Group. And we are the group that is hosting this webinar today. This is the second session of a three-part education series. Today's webinar, again, will be focused on healing justice. Before we dive into the content, which is, again, really exciting, I want to just give you a brief overview of CCJFG for those folks on the webinar who are not familiar with our work. CCJFG is a community of funders and philanthropists here in California who are committed to supporting the movement against policing, criminalization, and incarceration. One of the ways that we do this work is that we gather our members together to learn from movement leaders and those folks who are most impacted by these issues, just like we're doing today. Another way that we do this and we work towards our mission, our vision, is really working to move funds and resources to support and sustain the work of these organizations. We're absolutely grateful to learn from movement leaders and experts, and we want to be accountable to our learning through our financial support. This funder education series really emerged from conversations amongst our steering committee about three topics that are commonly discussed in movement building spaces. The first is abolition, and hopefully, you know, some of the folks that are on this webinar participated in our first education series, which was focused on abolition. The second topic that we have been discussing within our steering committee is focused on community organizing, which will be the next education series, and we hope that you all join us and stay tuned for that upcoming session. And the third is on healing justice, which is this topic that we'll be discussing today. It was really important for us to create a space for funders to further their understanding of these concepts so that we can continue to align with movement folks on the ground. Planning for these sessions, you know, these sessions we started thinking about these sessions last year, and they couldn't be more relevant than they are today. As the world and our country grapples with this pandemic, we continue to see Black and Brown communities disparately impacted by this virus. And to make matters worse, our Black and Brown brothers and sisters, specifically our Black brothers and sisters, are still not safe, running in their communities or even in their homes. Well, it's critical to respond to this moment as we are experiencing this pandemic. We mustn't lose sight of these longer term struggles and our longer term goals. All of this is a lot for us to hold, and it's a lot for our community to hold. So today, we want to share some of the ways that our grantee partners and other, you know, really important experts sustain themselves and their organizations for this longer term battle. And this is through healing justice. Today, we hope to answer the following questions. What is healing justice? How is healing justice connected to organizing and movement building? What does healing justice look like in practice? And for funders, we'll cover the why and how of funding this work. Again, this is a 1.5 hour webinar. We'll hear from an incredible group of speakers. We're gonna have some time for Q&A, so please, we wanna make this as interactive as possible. So please utilize the Q&A function or chat to send your questions to our speakers. And the coordinator, Adrian Sky Roberts, will be helping us to manage our Q&A. And we'll have space at the end to answer your questions. At the end, we'll also follow up with some resources, regarding healing justice. And I also want to just say that we're really seeing this healing justice webinar as a sort of 101. If you're interested in going deeper and really doing some deeper work around healing justice, I want to refer you to the Funders for Justice Healing Justice Institute, which will have a series, a 4-part series that is going to really go deeper into healing justice, and it's going to start in July. If you're interested in that, Adrian will be sending out contact information for Lorraine Ramirez, who you can contact for more information about this fantastic opportunity coming up. So without further ado, I want to pass this wonderful mic to Prentice Hemphill, who will be giving us some framing and doing some light moderation of this webinar. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Gina, for that introduction, for grounding us, and thank you all for being present to this conversation. It feels like an honor for me to be able to speak with you all, to be on this panel, and to be able to deepen together our understanding of healing justice and what it offers to our movement. So I want to come in gratitude to this conversation and all of our openness to engage here. So I am tasked with breaking down healing justice a bit here, and then we're gonna keep kind of, like I said, deepening into that and understanding how it's happening on the ground in a multitude of ways. First, I wanna say, introduce myself. I am a somatics and embodiment practitioner and teacher. I also am the co-founder and a co-director of a project called Resilient Strategies that is really holding as a part of our work this clarifying of the analysis around healing justice, maintaining the political center of healing justice, and also supporting organizations that are working to dismantle systems of oppression, particularly criminal legal apparatus, to maintain the resilience inside of changing conditions. So that's a lot of our work. So I want to ground us first in kind of understanding healing justice and how it emerges. It's kind of become at this point, an almost ubiquitous term in movement. Folks are using it all the time, and that's great, and folks are experimenting, which I'll talk about later. But it's often talked about and not all the time deeply understood what is actually the potential and the core of healing justice. So I want to talk about that a little bit today. So first I want to name that the kind of rejoining of our political selves and our well-being, the rejoining of those is not new work, that it actually indicates that there's been a rupture between how we understand the kind of experience of our lives and the well-being of our lives with our political lives and selves. And so healing justice is just in many ways, a marker in time that indicates that we are intentionally rejoining our practices with our politics. And why that is important. The term itself comes out of, as many of you know, I just always think it's important to name, Kara Page and the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, their work in the South in the early mid-2000s. That is where we get this term, and they developed a framework that many of us are engaging with and learning from still. It's important to name that because this work is so much about memory. What gets remembered, who gets remembered, and how. And so I want to keep forwarding our ability to remember our own lineages of brilliance and reclamation in this process. One definition that I use often of healing justice comes from Erica Woodland, who is a dear friend of mine and also the director of National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network. And what Erica offered in his definition is this, that healing justice is a community-led, emergent process to address trauma, grief, crisis, and violence, both historical and current. Healing justice is a political strategy and a spiritual framework rooted in histories and legacies of survival, ancestral traditions, and practices. So that's one of the ways that I'm holding healing justice. And you'll hear in that there's an expanse inside of that definition. It's actually calling on a multitude of practices, approaches, and strategies when we really ground ourselves in that definition. A couple things I want to pull out of that that I think are really critical is that healing justice really points to the historical necessity of healing, repair, and tending to our emotional, spiritual, and embodied selves. And that adds capacity fundamentally to our movement work. Healing justice gives us an opportunity to understand the real impacts of oppression and create strategies and movements and organizations that take that reality into account and are guided by that. One key element for me of healing justice is, well, first I'll say that I often get asked a question about healing justice's relationship to disability justice, to transformative justice. And I always say that there's a point in practice at which they are the same. Or another way of thinking about that is that they come from the same soil in many ways. They're asking very similar things of us. So if there's some confusion, it makes sense because they are related to one another and working for each other. And I think each of those frameworks has a particular emphasis that clarifies something for us. Healing justice, in my opinion, one of the things that it clarifies is trauma and understanding what trauma is, its impact, and then what we do in response to that. So trauma, again, is one of these words that gets talked about a lot, that we use a lot. And I think it's important because it happens a lot. And it's critical that we be clear about what we mean so that we can be precise about then what we do in response to that. So I'm not going to go so deeply into a kind of physiological definition of trauma, though I think that that's really important. But I'm going to say here that trauma, for me, some of the critical pieces to understand are that trauma is an embodied interruption in time that decreases capacity to be present, relational, and generative. Those are some of the ways I hold trauma. And what interruption in time is that our physiological, when we're overwhelmed by an event, our physiological selves can get stuck in moments in time or in experiences. And what that does, the short version of what that can do is that it can actually decrease our ability to have our own felt sense of power or self-determination on the level of self. It can also impact our ability to coordinate well, to build collective power. So trauma has that impact on us, and I think that's really important for us to understand. And it's not just an intellectual impact, it's an embodied physiological impact. One note I just want to say an aside is that it's really important for me, and a lot of my work is clarifying and defining these terms, because it gives us an opportunity to shape the conversation about what wellness is and how it is created or denied. And that the way that we understand the term trauma in and of itself is deeply connected to a history of political organizing. The research that has been done, the ways that trauma has been identified has largely been a result of the pressure of political organizing and saying, oh no, sexual violence, for example, is a trauma that needs to be addressed in certain ways. And that happens through feminist organizing, et cetera. So there's always been a kind of connection between trauma and the political realm. And in a lot of ways, how we identify trauma has to do with how we acknowledge harm, who has been harmed, and who we are committed to repair with. I think that when we expand that definition of trauma, that's also part of what we're doing. Another point I want to make here is that trauma in many ways is inherent to life. So sometimes we can talk about trauma and think that we're going to one day get to a world where there is no trauma. I would argue that that is not ever going to be the case, that trauma is actually built into life in many ways. We love someone and we maybe lose them, or we're overwhelmed by a storm or a naturally occurring event. So trauma is inherent to life in many ways, or it can be. But oppression is the organization and the distribution of that trauma. So that is the function in many ways of oppression. And I think we've thought about it, and systemic violence and those things. We're able to see that there are manipulations happening that have impact on certain communities. But we can also see this through the lens of understanding the role of trauma and the way it is utilized to stunt or disrupt power in marginalized communities. So that's a lot for me of what the frame of healing justice offers us, is a real deep understanding of the way trauma is used and utilized as a tool of oppression. The other piece here then is that healing justice reveals to us that power is recoverable and that healing can build power, which I think is really key for us to understand. And it's important for our movements to understand that a robust movement that can win is actually going to have an analysis about how we do it and what our wellness ultimately looks like and what it is for in the world. One thing I hear often around healing justice is, does every organization then have to tend to the traumatic experiences of every person in the organization? And my answer to that is that I think it is really critical for our organizations to have an analysis around healing justice, to figure out how it is and folds into as a part of the work. And I'm excited to hear some of the ways people are doing that on this call. But we also have to be thinking on the level of movement, that it's not only about individual organizations and how they incorporate healing justice, but part of the broad movement that I'm talking about has to include folks that are in different positions and are some folks that are attending to our well-being, are attending to folks that are living with illness. We have to include a wide array of experiences. We have to be led by disabled folks. There are so many ways that healing justice troubles what we've come to understand as the way movement work should be done. The last thing I want to say, kind of, is that a real key to understanding how we do this, how do we actually incorporate healing justice into our organizations or movements, has to do with resilience. And resilience, I always say, I get a lot of pushback when I use the word. People are like, I don't like that word. I don't like the way that it's been used on us and against us. And I want to reclaim the word in many ways, because I think resilience is not about withstanding. It's actually not about acclimating to conditions, but it's about a broader commitment to life and aliveness. That's the kind of resilience we're working towards. And so a definition that I often use of resilience is that it's our innate ability to be creative, adaptive, relational, and generative. It is also pointing to the practices that support us in being relational, adaptive, generative, and creative. That's what we're talking about with resilience. And if our movements are not centering resilience, then ultimately they won't sustain. And we'll see the breakdowns around that in our individual bodies and in the ways that we hold and experience conflict and fractures and all of that. That we want to be centering around resilience, because life will inherently promise trauma. So how do we center our movements around what is the antidote, which I think in part is resilience? This is the last piece that I want to share, that we are in a moment of experimentation in a lot of ways around healing justice. And I think that it's important for us to name that we are in a moment of experimentation, and we're in the context of a lot of shifts and change, which to me actually reinforces the need for us to develop our capacity of being adaptive, being responsive, that we are actually going to be experiencing a lot of tumult for a long time. So how do we be more resilient as folks involved and committed to the work of justice? So in that experimentation, some of the things that I've seen that are very compelling, and again, we're going to hear some really amazing examples, but these are the things I've seen and been a part of, things that I've also experimented on that feel really important for broadening how we think about healing justice. There is a lot of organizing of practitioners that is happening, which is one way that we start to bring folks from a depoliticized space into an organized and movement space. So organizing practitioners across modalities, from physicians to mental health professionals to community healers and practitioners, that organizing folks to mobilize, to show up when we need them, and also be engaged in dismantling what is harmful about the systems they're engaged in, is actually a critical healing justice intervention. There's also a lot of, I think I kind of mentioned it in here, but networking politicized healers to add capacity to movement efforts is something I've seen. Organizational culture shift work that is happening, dreaming up new ways of being together. I was teaching a course earlier today on conflict and how we build our emotional capacity for challenges and are able to be resilient in the face of the unknown and the breakdowns and make different choices. So that kind of work is also happening and being experimented with and is very exciting. There are also orgs and projects that are deeply committed to healing justice or running concurrent healing justice programs that are doing the work of healing and transforming our communities and building power at the same time, that I think are doing some really brilliant work. So those are just some of the examples of things that I have seen and that are really inspiring me around healing justice. To close, I just want to say, I watched the last talk on abolition, and again, it's like these are distinct and related frameworks and commitments that we're in. And I actually think it's important, if we talk about abolition as a goal, that what it's actually going to take in our movements and who we need to be on the other side of abolition, during and on the other side of abolition. I think healing justice gives us a lot of indication of how we do that, how we practice that, how we are together, how we relate to one another, what we dream up, how we relate to time, even who our targets are. It shifts when we start to understand the way trauma is utilized and the way wellness and the resources to heal are taken from us. So I think an abolitionist perspective and healing justice can go so well together, because the healing justice is the how we actualize that and the how we are together. So just want to offer that synergy and that connection around healing justice and abolition. And I'm actually really, really stoked to talk to the panelists and learn more. I think we all are, about how healing justice is being experimented, developed, and practiced on all of these levels. So first, I want to actually talk to Nicole Lee from the Urban Peace Movement. And hey, Nicole.
Hey.
I am really curious from you how you are incorporating healing justice into your work, or how your work is healing justice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Prentice, I thought that was so awesome. I really liked what you said about oppression being the organization and distribution of trauma. Yeah, for me, that's very, very powerful and super relevant to what I'm going to talk about. I'm wondering if everyone can see me and hear me, because my screen seems to be frozen. Can someone else come on and tell me whether you guys, okay, great.
See.
Excellent. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Before I do that, I guess I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Nicole Lee. I think I know a few of you that are on the webinar today. I can see your names in the chat box. So I'm the executive director of an organization in Oakland called Urban Peace Movement. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about our approach, which I think has healing justice kind of baked into it. I'm an Oakland native. I'm actually a 4th generation Oakland resident. My family is Chinese American. We've been in Oakland since the late 1800s. And yeah, I was born and raised here in the town. I'm an Oakland girl through and through. I've been doing community organizing since the late 90s when I was a young adult. And it was right around the time that California was sort of hitting this apex of we were going to become a majority people of color state. And there were all of these, I think most people on the webinar probably remember, but there were all of these horrific pieces of sort of referendums that were on the ballot that were specifically targeted toward people of color and communities of color. And we saw the rise of mass incarceration in California, 3 strikes, and the passage of Prop 21. And that was the political climate in which I became active and, joined the movement. And yeah, so I've been doing this work, starting to see some of those things come full circle, really excited about this moment, but also obviously feel like we have a lot of challenges before us, clearly. So I'm gonna share my screen and talk a little bit about our work. So here we go. So I think you guys can see my screen now. Okay, so Urban Peace Movement, our mission as an organization is to build youth and community leadership to transform the culture and the social conditions that drive mass incarceration and community violence in our communities and communities of color. I'll just say for me personally, and I became active, I kind of described the political climate that I became active in, but I really became active in the movement because I care about Oakland. For me, it has always been about Oakland. It's still about Oakland. I obviously have a broader political analysis that includes, places internationally and, the way that sort of capitalist and economic forces move. But at the end of the day, for me, this work is about Oakland. So this is a cover from an Oakland Tribune in 2003. I think many folks are familiar with this, but community violence is something that Oakland has experienced for as long as I can remember. This cover was the cover of the Tribune that sort of laid out the impact of community violence over the past year in Oakland in 2003. For me, this slide is really personal because the photo in the front, the center right there of the police with the yellow tape was taken in front of my next door neighbor's yard in West Oakland. And I was home when this happened, actually. It was about 8 o'clock at night. I had just walked to the liquor store and I came back home, and I was home for about 20 minutes. And I remember hearing 4 gunshots really loud, so loud it sounded like the person let the gun off in my own house. And then I heard my upstairs neighbor running to the front of our building. And he was the first person to discover the person who had been shot. It was a man in his late 50s or early 60s who had been paroled 3 days prior to being killed in front of our house. It was just hugely, hugely traumatic in the way that Prentice kind of described. This was really the impetus of Urban Peace Movement. We started in 2006, actually, as a project under the Ella Baker Center when I worked there, called Silence the Violence. And it was really in response to an outbreak of community violence that Oakland was experiencing in 2006. In 2006, we were also coming off the heels of this organizing campaign. And so the organization that preceded Urban Peace Movement and Silence the Violence was an organizing project that I helped to lead for the Ella Baker Center called Let's Get Free. You can see our logo with Books Not Bars logo on the CYA banner up there. As most of you know, the governor in his May revise last week announced that he will be closing the remaining CYA, or now called DJJ facilities in the state of California, which is a huge victory, I think, for our side and for the side of Abolition. It also, in some ways we were a little blindsided by the quickness of this decision and didn't know that it was coming, and it does present some real challenges for us at the local level. But I do think overall, most of us agree that this is a good thing. The organizing of, I think most folks know, this campaign started around 2005 when there were about 10,000 young people in the CYA and 10 facilities around the state of California. Those are photos below of wards being beaten up by guards. And there was a lawsuit that some legal advocates made against the state of California for not providing safety for young people when they were students inside CYA. So the system responded to that lawsuit by putting young people in cages with slots right there. And teachers could pass, you can see the teacher on the far end of that photo, pass reading materials, papers, and educational materials through the slot to the kids in the cage. And there were also other kids in that classroom that were not in cages, that were expected to study and be students, sitting next to other kids that were in cages like that. And so, when we talk about trauma and healing justice, this is what we're talking about. Okay, so our approach at Urban Peace Movement is an approach that actually Sean Ginwright and I named together when we did some work a few years ago, which we call healing-centered youth organizing. Last night I created this thing that I'm calling the 4 Noble Principles, which is obviously a nod to Buddhist thought. I just made that up yesterday. But it's really our 4 principles of healing-centered youth organizing. So the first principle is, and a lot of this is, really, I think, resonates with what Prentice just laid out for us so eloquently. So the first principle is that oppression causes trauma. And I think, the past 2 slides really show that, but that systems of oppression, the things that organizing seeks to change, the reason we're trying to change those things at the end of the day is because they cause trauma and harm in our neighborhoods, in our families, in our communities, and in our lives. The second principle is that, so then in response to that, our mission as social justice, change makers has to be that we both do organizing and healing work. Because if we know that oppression causes trauma, then we also have to, not only do we have to change the systems that keep re-traumatizing our communities, we also have to do the work of healing to repair the trauma that has been created by these systems. And then the last two principles are that healing helps us organize. So I think a lot of times as community organizers, whether or not we sort of see our work as healing justice work or not, I think most of us at one point or another have confronted this problem of burnout. Just that, we're really like David and Goliath. We're like the people with the little rock, and we're taking on these systems that have billions of dollars, and we have our little, $25,000 grant and our 5 people, and we're really trying to take on these systems that are so stacked against us, and we still win. We still manage to win in the face of that, but there is, I think a lot of us have gotten to a point in our work where we really confront these moments of like, how much longer can I do this? So I think on one level, we've discovered that healing is a way that helps sustain us in the work and makes the work more doable. And I think that a lot of our movements have had to respond or incorporate healing out of necessity. Really, getting to a place where we realized we couldn't go on anymore if we didn't take on the work of healing. But there's actually another piece of healing that I think is important to mention beyond that. And that is that, I think one thing I've discovered, and when you really go down the rabbit hole of doing deep healing work or mindfulness or, there's many ways to call the work of healing. You realize that things that weren't possible before become possible when you do healing. And I guess a pragmatic way to describe that is that when you do healing work, it gives you, I think Sean, and you'll hear from Sean in a minute, he talks a lot about hope. But when you do healing work, it allows you the space to envision and to create and to imagine something that maybe you couldn't even see before you did healing. And, I think a lot of spiritual traditions talk about miracles. I think miracles get created in the space of healing because you're allowed to imagine things that maybe weren't even on your radar screen before you sat quietly or took care of yourself. So I think that healing really, at the end of the day, our social change work is about envisioning something different. It's not just about shutting things down. It's about recreating the world that we know that we actually deserve. And healing is the pathway for us to imagine what that would look like. Okay, so the last principle that I have on here, is that organizing helps us heal. So I think I learned this when I was a union organizer back in 1998. And I remember my lead organizer, who I don't actually think thought about healing that much, told me this story about a worker who was on her committee, who was actually struggling with some issues at home in her family, and was in an abusive relationship. And this organizer recounted the story that when the worker at work found her voice as an organizer, not related to what was happening in her household, but when she was able to stand up to the boss, to stand up on behalf of other workers, her coworkers who were, being disrespected. When she was able to go to her manager or her boss and say, you know what, the contract actually says that we're supposed to get these things and we're not being given them. And when she found the courage and the voice to do that, she actually found the courage and the voice to get out of the abusive relationship she was in. And I have seen that time and time again in our work with young people. You know, organizing is really the process of finding your voice and finding your own agency. And when you do that in one area of your life, you can't help but for that to have an impact on the other areas of your life. And so organizing, when held in the right way, actually aids us in our process of healing. So this is sort of what it looks like for us. We have 2 youth organizing programs, if you will. One of them is called the Determination Black Men's Group. It's a healing and a brotherhood circle for Black men in Oakland, for young people who identify as Black men, kind of transitioning age young people, I guess is what the field calls it, but young adults, in other words. Yeah, this group is really incredible. They do organizing stuff. Prince, who many of you know that we lost a year and a half ago, was super involved with this group and really helped this group to thrive. The other facilitator is in the center in white, Adimu Madun, who's a really incredible cultural educator. Adimu himself is actually an Ifa practitioner, and so he really has brought a level of African-centered healing to this group. Yeah, and they're really amazing. The other group that we have is Leaders in Training, which is our, I skipped past this one. This is just a sample of some of the cultural work that the Determination group has done in the past. They did these posters a few years ago. They designed them themselves, and they kind of tell the story about what they're determined to do in their own lives. And we were able to get them placed in bus shelters throughout the city of Oakland. So that's, those are some of the Determination members and the things that they were working on in their own lives. So the second program we have is called Leaders in Training. It's a youth organizing program for high school age young people. It's a multiracial high school youth organizing program. Those are the hoodies they designed last year. They actually have Assata Shakur's face on them, and then the quote about "It is our duty to fight, it is our duty to win" on the back of the hoodie. They're really dope hoodies. And our work is really focused on decarcerating Alameda County and justice reinvestment, which I think most of you know is this idea that all of these, that these systems of these carceral and criminalizing systems, law enforcement systems, get pretty much like a blank check. In Alameda County, everyone across the board, from the state, the county, the feds, I think right now are looking at experiencing budgetary shortfalls because of COVID. And despite that, schools are closing here. Before COVID, schools were closing here in Oakland. And despite that, last week, Alameda County voted to increase the sheriff's budget, even though the sheriff, has had over 50 people die in custody in the past 5 years in our county jail. He's a racist. He retweets Trump stuff, and he gets this blank check to do whatever he wants in our county. And so we feel like money should be divested from those systems and invested in serving people in the community instead. And so that's sort of this idea of justice reinvestment. For UPM, we have 2 initiatives. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my buttons. So the first is DA accountability, and really looking at the district attorney as being the gatekeeper in a lot of ways to the criminal justice system locally. And so really putting a lot of pressure on her office around, the really wide level of decision-making they have about who gets charged, who gets access to alternatives, what kinds of alternatives are being utilized in our county. And so really, building a coalition to put pressure on her. And the second is around Alameda County juvenile justice system transformation. And so right now, one of the things we're responding to is trying to stop the county from a $75 million expenditure to rebuild our juvenile detention camp called Camp Sweeney here in Alameda County. Even though the average daily population in there is 14 boys, there are 14 boys in there currently. and they're trying to spend $75 million to rebuild it at 100 beds. And so again, this is an example of just, you know, a system, a carceral system, just getting a blank check to do whatever they want when everybody else is scrambling to try to find funding. Okay, so I'm gonna move us on. So these are some photos from one of our campaigns, the Free Our Kids campaign, which is the campaign that I just described around Camp Sweeney. You can see our coalition members here on the lower part of it. It includes our members, but also, you know, some of our amazing partners from all around Alameda County, folks like Courage, the Young Women's Freedom Center, the Ella Baker Center, the East Bay Community Law Center, Restore Oakland, the Justice Reinvestment Coalition, a lot of our amazing partners. There in the center, we did a town hall in January and an action to the public protection meeting right around Valentine's Day. And we landed the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle the next morning. And that's one of UPM's youth organizers, Robert Page, on the front page there. So this is Rob. I'm going to give you a taste of what healing-centered organizing looks like in action. So this is Rob. Oops, here we go. I'm gonna just play this if I can.
Have saved us from this. Only savior has been the community. Only savior has been our parents. But apparently the appearance of parents is as rare as niggas in Paris. You see, we all go perish. And we sit idle and watch our young daughters and fathers locked to suicidal, who then plays the role of model. For the younger generation, imagine this. 10-year-old boy shot twice in 1 year. Witness his 5-year-old cousin shot dead and father stabbed to death. Canard Island. Who's to blame him if he's supposed to survive him and you hear that click clap, bang, bang, you did. You didn't hear about him, right? You see, he was exposed to mushroom clouds that spontaneously combust like stove pilots. You drove by it, hearing the sound of illegitimate laughter, like a war for an assault and battle. Assault rifles scattering black lines are splattered, because it just don't matter. And we internalize the theory. Hide from anything nearly 2 blocks of bed, we put on new pieces of hair, and when ratchet becomes dead to me, I go over there and see. This association makes me a part of this nation. The nation that was built on hatred for dogs. So now I'm guilty by association for aiding these sharks. So now who's to blame? When you hear that click, clap, bang, bang, you did.
Okay, so that just gives you a sense, you know, part of, I think, organizing is using culture as a way to create a sense of belonging and expression. And I think youth organizing in particular has done a really good job of always incorporating that, but I do think that's a really important part of community healing. I'm at the end of my time, so I'm just gonna wrap up by saying that in addition to our organizing, UPM has a community healing initiative in which we do healing and wellness pop-up festivals, actually called Scratch and Fade. We do regular community healing circles in the community for both youth and adults. And we do grief circles, kind of crisis response grief circles when homicides occur in our community. And then we have some other pieces to that work as well. So this is just really quickly some photos of our Scratch and Fade pop-up. We center our healing and wellness pop-ups not around things like meditation and massage, although we do offer meditation and massage and elder blessings at these pop-ups. We center them around nails and barbers because we really think that in our own communities and for ourselves, actually also as members of this community, a lot of times going to the nail shop or going to get a lineup is kind of a gateway self-care practice in communities of color. And so we centered our pop-ups around those as healing modalities. And then when people get there, they're introduced to other modalities of healing, including things like elder blessings and massage and cupping and acupuncture. On the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you'll see Sid. He does a project called Trap Nature, where he brings out rattlesnakes and snakes and teaches people in Oakland about nature. So yeah, that's kind of it. And I know I'm at my, that's it. The last thing is 510 Day. We did an event that became the response to Barbecue Becky in Oakland. You know, I think we basically threw a party in the same place that this woman called the cops on some of our friends, Kenzie in the background, for barbecuing, which became known as barbecuing while black. And obviously Barbecue Becky, you know, went to internet fame from that. But we did a party right after 5 days or 10 days after that occurred. And it really was a party and a party that became our protest to that act of racism in our own community, something that, you know, we just saw again in Central Park with the dog walker. And so this is just people partying, and this video went viral. And I think sort of okay, and that's it. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Nicole, I was dancing over here.
Thanks. Yeah. So that's it.
Thank you, Nicole.
Feeling like
That's right. Thank you so much for that and for those examples and for that resilience at the end. I think we can all feel that little taste we got. Want to move over to Sean and Sean Jenwright. I would love to hear about your work and particularly how healing justice is informing how you're thinking about or working with systems or whatever it is that you'd like to offer.
Thanks, Prentice, and thanks, Nicole. Nicole and I have worked together for quite some time here in Oakland, working with young people. My comments are going to really focus on the system, like how do we think about the systems where our young people are, and how can philanthropy best address the ways in which systems create harm. You've already heard about how we're conceptualizing healing justice. That is, oppression and the systems that we've created in our society have inflicted various types of harm. And one of the notes that I think is important is that when we talk about trauma, generally trauma as a term has been very narrowly defined in a very psychological medical model way. What Prentice shared and with Nicole shared is that many folks that are doing healing justice are reclaiming and renaming what constitutes trauma. And in many of our communities, trauma is not only experienced individually, but it's experienced collectively. And if it is experienced collectively, then we also need to have a much more robust way of addressing and creating opportunities for restoration. So the three things I'm going to do today is sort of talk a little bit about, one, how do I see kind of the concept of healing justice. Second, sort of what does healing justice mean for the systems that we work in and that our young people play in, and that where our young people go to school and in education. And then third, how might we actually begin to address or forward a healing justice a body of work. The way that I see it is that you have to think about healing justice as an ecosystem that occurs at the individual, the interpersonal, and at the institutional level simultaneously. And so I'll have some thoughts about what philanthropy can specifically begin to think about and do as a way to buttress a much more robust healing justice strategy. Let me start off with kind of a really quick way that I think it's important to think about healing justice. I was writing about 6 or 7 years ago about healing, and my own work in Oakland is working with African American youth. And for quite some time, what used to be called youth development, I realized that we weren't just doing youth development with these African American young people who would come into our after school program and talk about fear of the police and talk about shame of being Black and talk about all kinds of harm as a result of forms of their identity that is waged in school and waged in their streets. And so I realized that youth development is while it's necessary, it's just not sufficient to talk about what the Black kids that I was working with really needed. And so that's where we began to talk about the necessity of healing, and then connected with people who were already doing this magnificent work. Prentice already mentioned Cara doing the healing justice, and Nicole Lee, who is already doing a lot of this really important work. But what we did is we tried to at least provide a concept. And I remember my mama saying when I was talking about healing, and I was writing about healing, and my mama said, "Baby, what they healing from?" And it really stuck, that question really stuck with me, which is how do we actually begin to name in a much more comprehensive way the way in which oppression in our systems harm? Because if we understand that, then we could actually have an equivalent response. I'm going to attempt to share my screen because I just think this one slide I'm going to show is useful for us thinking about how harm occurs. So this is a piece of research that was conducted by Virginia O'Leary. And she says that when we think about harm and trauma in our society, that there's a couple of things that happen, right? Right now, we are all experiencing a social trauma. The COVID is a form of a social trauma, and it's experienced individually. It's experienced in our relationships with our family and people we work with, and it's experienced collectively as a society. Our watching of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery a few weeks ago and just yesterday, like all of these ways in which we're experiencing our society creates a form of social trauma. And what the research says is that when we experience a form of social trauma, a couple things happen. This line that this person on, that line represents individual or can represent an institution or it could represent an entire society. But when we experience a form of social trauma, our normal level of functioning declines, and that we really cannot function in the same way that we were prior to the instance of trauma. All we do when we experience a form of social trauma is we have three responses. The first response is survival. We just want to get through the day. We just want to get through the week. If we're an institution, right now as a society, we're experiencing survival, trying to get through COVID. But sometimes we can get the kind of support that we need to recover, right? That we get back to our normal level of functioning that we were prior to the instance of trauma, right? That's called recovery. And then the last is what I think is really interesting. And the research says there's a third level called thriving. And thriving means that we're actually at a stronger, more vibrant, more resilient, more productive level of being and functioning than we were prior to our experience of the social trauma. The distance between A and C and the distance between B and C is what I refer to as healing and healing justice. And healing justice is assuring that the rules, the laws, the resources are necessary, not just for survival, not only just for recovery, but for thriving. What you saw that Nicole Lee just presented with the party and with the response to Barbecue Becky wasn't just a dance. It wasn't just a time to party in the street, but it was a reclamation of people's joy. It was a reclamation of how people be together, right? And so that is an instance, and I think a profound example of thriving when people can reclaim their space and be in their space in a way that is rejoiceful and that feeds their own sense of well-being and belonging. And so when we talk about healing justice is not just about the survival or recovery. One way you should be considering and thinking about your strategies around funding is to what extent is your funding streams, to what extent is your theory of change and your foundations focused on C as opposed to A? If you find, for example, that you're responding to COVID, which is necessary right now, but if we stick only in funding strategies A and B, but we're not actually considering what constitutes C, then we're actually not facilitating a more robust pathway to healing. So that's one of the things that I wanted to just sort of tee up. And so one of the things that I think is important to think about trauma is that when we talk about trauma, it is historical, it's intergenerational, and that these things happen at the individual level, at the interpersonal level, and at the institutional level. And so if we think about that ecosystem of trauma, individual, interpersonal, institutional. Then we also have to have equivalent responses to it. We already have individual responses to trauma, which is largely therapy and sort of one-on-one types of modalities of restoration. And that's important and necessary. But like I said before, our communities experience trauma collectively. And so we also have to think about collective response and, thirdly, institutional responses. So if we think about the institutional responses, and particularly for philanthropy, there's a couple of recommendations or thoughts I'd like to share. The first is that there's a tendency for those who are in philanthropy, and I don't consider myself a philanthropist, but I'm the board chair for the California Endowment, so I'm involved with philanthropy. And I want to give some examples of how our foundation is really trying to bring healing justice frame into the work and the strategies and the theory, the thinking that we're doing. And so the first is that there's a tendency for philanthropy to think about funding in terms of strategy, right? In terms of how we give out money or how we sort of deploy resources to a particular issue. And I think that that's important. But when we think about healing justice only in terms of a funding strategy, we're only looking at a piece of the ecosystem. Because what that does is it doesn't require philanthropy to reflect on the ways in which philanthropy in and of itself does harm to communities. The way that philanthropy even gives out money sometimes can create harm to communities around competition and around denials. And there's all sorts of ways that philanthropy may have reverberating harm in communities without having some greater reflection. So that's one thing. The second is that in philanthropy, we can't think of healing justice just as an issue or a strategy on the program side of the work. It also has to happen on the investment side of the work. And so if you are a program officer or a program director, if you are funding strategies that are about well-being and healing, but your investments in that foundation are still with, R.J. Reynolds and prisons, well, then that means that there's a disconnect, right? And that means that you have to think about the board has to be involved in healing justice. The investments have to be aligned with a healing justice frame as well as the program. My experience is that means that you have to have ongoing courageous conversations with the board and the board president. And that means you have to talk about race. You have to name race and not hide it in funding guidelines. You have to actually lift it up. You have to use phrases like oppression, right? These are the ways in which we begin to bring together all the components of the institution of philanthropy as a way to move forward a much more robust healing justice strategy. Just four key recommendations that I think are important, and then I'll stop. And we're doing these. I share these ideas as board chair with our board, as well as for the California Endowment. What I'm recommending in our organization is that we make 4 pivots as an organization and how we bring together a healing justice framework. And those 4 pivots are as follows. The first pivot is a pivot in our awareness. And that means that rather than only focusing on the analysis, right, the analysis of the problems we wish to solve, that we have to hold up, use a lens, and I'm sorry, I'm moving too fast. Rather than only using a lens to do an analysis of the problems we face in California, we also have to use a mirror. And that mirror work is the deep self-reflection about what it means to be a philanthropist, about what it means to be a person of color, about what it means to be a program officer. But the mirror work means that's internal and not external. And so we're building the organization, we're building the board's capacity, we're building the staff's capacity to do more and more ongoing self-reflection. Number 2 is a pivot in our relationships. And that pivot means that we have to pivot from transactional relationships to transformative relationships. And that means that we have to not only see ourselves as a function of our titles, right? That I know you by what you do, but we have to have conversations and opportunities to know our humanity. That means I can understand what you're fearing. I can understand what you're afraid of. I understand what brings you joy. But how do we cultivate that as an organization and in philanthropy? That means we have to spend more time to get to know each other at a deeper level. The third pivot is a pivot in possibility, a pivot from only thinking about problems to thinking about possibilities. And that is the hope and the imagination that we talked about that Nicole Lee mentioned, and the role of hope and being able to see the future and be able to imagine the kind of communities we want to create. And then lastly, we have to make a pivot from a life of frenzy and chasing our to-do list and recognize that these things sometimes take time and that we have to shift from frenzy to flow. That means just to slow down a little bit, right? And not always believe that we have to have so much on our plate that it makes our work always on a rat race or always sort of on a treadmill of frenzy. I'm gonna stop there and then turn it back over to Prentice, who will open it up.
Thank you, Sean, so much. Thank you for those calls to action, that clarity there. I want to move to Kiyomi now, and kind of following a similar thread, I'm curious how you and Third Wave Fund, how you've incorporated healing justice into how you do your work and what you fund.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you all for speaking. This has been such a powerful webinar just to hear and observe and to share the space with y'all. I feel very, very grateful. Yeah, so I'm Kiyomi Fujikawa with the Third Wave Fund. Third Wave is an activist fund that resources youth-led gender justice movement. When we fund nationally, we prioritize grassroots groups that are led by women of color, trans and gender non-conforming people of color under the age of 35. And usually it's folks that, have a small budget that are, relatively small grassroots groups, including non-C3 groups, non-fiscally sponsored groups. And yeah, before I dive in a little bit more into, who Third Wave is and how we do that, I also want to just back up for a moment and name some of the legacy that comes to, of how I came to the work that we're doing and how really I learned about healing justice, and I think really informed the ways that Third Wave has come to think about healing justice. So do want to continue to shout out Kara Page and Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective for naming this. If folks are interested in kind of geeking out and learning more about that work and about sort of, what was happening around in the, early 2000s around healing justice work, there is a podcast called Irresistible that Kara Page and Susan Raffo were interviewed for that I think is really powerful. I'll put it in the chat in a moment. And yeah, I do want to, so just really name that legacy of the healing justice practice spaces at the US Social Forum, at the Allied Media Conference, many of which were, sort of started through Kindred, Southern Healing Justice Collective. And also I want to name this political home that I have here. I'm based up on Duwamish Coast Salish territory, also known as Seattle, Washington, and want to bring into the room a legacy of organizing that comes from a group called API Chaya, and they do API Chaya is an anti-violence organization, and really looking at transformative justice as a response to violence, and knowing, folks on this call probably understand that punitive responses to violence and harm are not what are going to get us free and are not what are going to help us. And really, if we're like, okay, if not that, what can it be? And I think the answer is healing. And I think Prentice spoke, so well to kind of this soil that is germinating healing justice, transformative justice, disability justice, all kind of coming together. So yeah, I want to shout that out, and just that we're kind of grounding in this moment of like, what do we do this work for? What is the vision? Not just, sort of what we're up against or what we wish was sort of off our back, but also, how are we, transforming this into something that is an even more powerful moment. So, so with that, kind of diving to Third Wave and Third Wave's work, So how Third Wave came to healing justice, in my understanding, and Third Wave has been doing it for a long time. I know my colleague Joy Messenger is on this call. I do want to give her a shout out in terms of really building this work up at Third Wave before I was there. But, you know, I think it really came from listening to our grantees and centering what they needed. We knew that, like, if, you know, if we have a bet to take, we're going to take that bet on young women of color and young trans and gender nonconforming people of color who are doing grassroots organizing work. And we're like, okay, we're not going to be prescriptive around, you know, what the win is, what the win looks like, or how to get there. We really want to be holistic and know that, like, you're the experts on envisioning this organizing. And really what we heard from so many folks was the need to, you know, was that organizing models as they were set up were just burning folks out, we're running folks ragged, we're taking and giving some back to folks, but not in the ways that they really wanted. And especially when there were sort of top-down driven campaigns that, you know, were asking folks to do this work and sort of adopt a martyr identity was really difficult. And folks wanted more space to heal and recognize, you know, wanted space to uplift that so much care work and healing work was happening. And because it was feminized labor, it also wasn't valued in the same ways that it should be. And the other piece, you know, I think funders now really like to talk about intersectionality and, you know, knowing that the folks who are most impacted should be leading. And I think a lot of times there's just a like, okay, well, put that person in the room, and the room is still this, you know, capitalist white supremacist spot that folks are just supposed to show up to and know how to navigate and know how to work through. And, you know, essentially it's like we're getting folks into this burning building and we're calling it intersectionality and not looking at, like, actually what is the building that we want to create? What's the room that we want to be in together? And how do we want to be making that change? So I think also part of this was thinking through, like, what is actually the leadership development that's needed for our young grassroots leaders, for ourselves, to actually be navigating this trauma that is kind of intrinsic, not only to our lives of who we are, and, you know, the violence that we experience on the day-to-day, but also, you know, what we're experiencing through our organizing and also, as, you know, Sean mentioned, through philanthropy itself. And so, you know, I think, with that, a lot of the self-care regimes that sort of came out, I'm not going to knock self-care. I love self-care. I will take self-care any day of the week. And I want to just acknowledge that, you know, that's the individual response. That's kind of that medical model response that Sean mentioned. And actually we need a more robust, more collectivized forms of healing and forms of care work to make sure that we're really centering folks. So, and yeah, and to build on the piece that Nicole had shared, just to give some examples of the type of work that we're funding at Third Wave in terms of healing justice, because really, you know, we're not prescriptive. We're like, tell us about the work you're doing and why it is healing justice or not. And, you know, some of that is like sort of coming from the point of healing, you know, sort of being an entry point for folks to become organizers, like Nicole was, you know, mentioned in the 4 noble principles or noble truths. You know, and we see that with Trans Queer Pueblo, who's working out of Arizona, who started a healing and health clinic with undocumented trans and queer folks in Arizona, knowing that, you know, most of those folks couldn't find the practitioners that they could work with and couldn't find health clinics that would accept them as undocumented folks, as folks who are uninsured. And that is actually an entry point to get folks, you know, to the radical organizing work that Trans Queer Pueblo was doing. And, you know, we also hear from a lot of groups that just need time to rest and rejuvenate and, you know, space to really dream and sort of counter this burnout from what is such, you know, this results-centered sort of capitalistic frame of how we're measuring winning and losing. So with that in mind, I want to talk about that, you know, it's not, as Sean mentioned, healing justice as a funder doesn't mean just like what you're funding. And are you like, okay, we checked healing justice off the box. We, you know, put 5% of our money towards healing justice. So there you go. but actually needs to be really integrated not only into the types of organizing work that you're funding across the board, but also how we do this work. So I do want to talk a little bit about how Third Wave does that. And, you know, as has been mentioned, as probably all of you know, as probably many of you might experience on the daily, you know, philanthropy is an institution that perpetuates trauma and oppression. It is not set up as a tool for liberation. You know, hopefully we're all in this work to sort of do this work for a while and change this system to something that, you know, can support movements and, you know, become something else. And I think particularly in this moment of COVID-19, it's like such an opportunity to kind of reimagine what else this could be. So, you know, thinking about how we communicate with our grantees or interact with them, how we receive proposals, how we get reports, how we even reply to groups that we aren't going to fund, how we value their time, what that means, all has an intersection with healing justice and an analysis of trauma in what our organization is doing. And I think with that in mind and with, you know, the news articles that are coming out right now about the police violence in Minneapolis, I think one thing that is just so live for me is how a charity frame, you know, if we're imagining philanthropy in the sense of a charity frame, we really see that there's an expectation for marginalized people to sort of perform their traumas rather than focusing on their strengths, on their resilience, on how they're making it through. But there's actually like this, this expectation that folks are supposed to kind of perform their trauma and have their trauma be on display and have their trauma be used sort of for the benefits for everyone else. And I just want to name how heartbreaking that is, how terrible that is, how that shouldn't be how we are approaching our work as funders, that this charity model is really something we need to shift away from. And actually realizing that like, once the money has been put into our foundations or, you know, put into, you know, has been made as that tax deductible gift that exists in your foundation, that's actually public money. And that money doesn't necessarily belong to you as a program officer or you as a person who even made that donation or made that money. Like at that point, that money is actually public money and folks should be honored for the ways that they're able to kind of show up through their strengths rather than, you know, kind of that performance of trauma. And, you know, this other piece is really about making space for folks who are the most impacted. So one of the things that Third Wave does, we have a participatory grant making program that's called the Sex Worker Giving Circle. We know that sex workers are disproportionately targeted by police, policing, and prisons. We know that sex workers really have the skills to, you know what the solution should be to get sex workers free and to change some of those criminalization patterns. And, you know, bringing those folks to philanthropy, to spaces where they were, you know, fundraising and making big asks to major donors and deciding where, you know, large for us grant-sized dollars were going. Wasn't something that, you know, like to go back to that piece around just sort of expecting folks to be able to come into the room, wasn't something that we could just open it up and say like, hey, here you go, make this decision with these dollars. It actually took some coaching, some healing. And I do think, you know, for our funding officer there is a former social worker. And I do think there's just so many skills that come with that in terms of really making sure that especially non-wealthy folks are able to participate within philanthropy, because it is a whole new world. For folks that, you know, have a background in philanthropy, you've probably had a whole life of being coached to kind of be into that in relationship with money. And so kind of rethinking what that means. I'm mindful of time, so I just want to get to maybe one or two more points. And I think, yeah, I think really if you could take away one thing from this, you know, it's that we need philanthropy to be different. And the ways that philanthropy is going to be different is actually going to be informed by movements, by folks who are doing the work on the ground. So how do you want those movements to look? Who do you want those movement leaders to be? Do you want them to be folks that are, you know, sort of focused on just these wins and sort of just kind of those policy pieces? Or do we want, you know, sort of this space for a more holistic, visionary future that, you know, can kind of reimagine what it means to be doing this work, what it means to be doing philanthropy. And, you know, it is going to be the movements that are informing our work that are going to be changing philanthropy. We will navigate within that. We will make changes within that. We will talk to our boards, talk to our donors, talk to our folks. We have a role in that. And, you know, that vision and the practices that we're going to learn are going to come from movements, because that's where they've always come from. And so, you know, we have this opportunity to sort of get behind them and rep them or not. And so I think, you know, for me and Third Wave, I think the answer is really clear. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, everyone. This is fantastic. All the points that you all made were just right on point. I'm sitting here like head nodding to so many of the points that you all are making. And I recognize that we have 10 minutes for Q&A. And so we do have a question posed to Sean and Nicole. And so the question is, as we are witnessing the closure of prisons and DJJ, what are some of your ideas or creative vision for healing alternatives to these systems of punishment? So I will, the questions for Nicole and or Sean.
I'll say real quick, Nicole, then you can jump in. So that question just came up with the closure of the juvenile hall in San Francisco, and what would be used, what those dollars will be used for. I think I just responded to that question in the chat. I think we need to really reimagine those systems and institutions of well-being, and that's creating wellness centers, creating and training an army or a cadre of credible messenger mental health workers, folks that can go into the community and actually deliver microdoses of well-being and health and mental health. That's training barbers and beauty shops in what Nicole showed us, delivering mental health strategies and wellness strategies, so that our communities are saturated, not dosed, but saturated with opportunities to be well. And the reason we have healing justice in the first place is the lack of the existing institutions to actually provide the kind of mental health support and wellness support that our communities need.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You know, James Bell, who Gina used to work with, talks about that, you know, that the systems of incarceration purport to be public safety systems, but they're actually not. They're actually systems with the intention of social control, and that instead we need systems of well-being instead of systems of social control. And so these things should not be up under probation or the sheriff's department to run. And I think that's one of the dangers we see right now, is that as these discussions that we're having are taking traction, we're seeing probation departments, sheriff departments try to position to be like, well, we can run youth development. And we really believe that our communities need to be served in our communities and shouldn't have to be, you know, receiving services after they're being punished for something, that we shouldn't have systems of punishment, but instead systems of well-being. And I think that, you know, like Scratch and Fade is our little way of planting a seed for and 510 Day, you know, the party outside at the lake. There are little ways of planting seeds of like, what would it actually look like to have systems of well-being, and how do you do that and make an intervention like that at a community level? I also think people should get paid well to do them. I mean, some of my friends are people that I grew up with are probation officers because, you know, they wanted to serve young people and they also wanted to make a living wage. And so they find themselves in these, embedded in these systems that are really systems of punishment. So how do we move folk, you know, obviously not all of them, but the people who are, you know, really well, people with real kind hearts that do that work into systems that actually support people of color in making money and actually are not about punishing people, but are about creating wellness in our community. How do we value those things?
Yeah, great, thank you. I have another question here that asks, how does healing justice in philanthropy translate into sharing out larger amounts of funding over the minimum 5%? So I can throw that over to Sean, Kiyomi.
Well, first of all, the question is where's the 5%? That's the first question, because if you don't know where the 5% is invested, then spending more doesn't, or where the 95% is invested, I'm sorry, where the 95% is invested, that could be so disconnected for the little 5% that you could actually be doing more harm where it's invested than the 5% is giving out. So that's one thing. Where's your money and how's it invested? And then the second is, 5% is a minimum IRS guideline. It's not a maximum, but people use that as the sort of, as a maximum. But particularly in times like this, people should be thinking about 10%. This is not a time to retrench. This is a time to really lean into those assets. I was reading somewhere that if all the donor advised funds would spin down, that's almost $400 billion of assets that are just sitting somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a number of ways that we can really begin to reimagine assets that can be deployed in a way that has a benefit to our communities.
Yeah, and if I could just build on that, I've seen calls to be like, actually, if we bumped up above that 5%, that's part of the economic stimulus bill that could be happening. And so like actually a push right now to legislators asking folks, because I think, having foundations do it on their own is great. If you're an individual foundation, if you can make that move, and actually on a systems level, it might happen faster if we're able to actually, push Congress to, change this level of payout that's there. And I think one thing that Healing Justice has really centered for me is this idea of abundance and knowing, we're not coming from places of scarcity, and I think abundance really resonates with Prentice's definition of resilience in terms of all the creativity, all the gifts that we have in this work. And I think philanthropy is not a place where scarcity should exist. Philanthropy is actually the place that is the most abundant. So why are we clinging to that 5%? Why are we, sort of eking out small dollars and really asking folks to do so much reporting, these long proposal applications, just all the bureaucracy that's required for it when it could just be going directly to movement. So I think that is absolutely part of a Healing Justice frame.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. So it's 1:56 now. I'm looking and I don't see any more questions. I'm going to call on our participants. This is a great opportunity. You have a few minutes and you have these amazing speakers here. Are there any burning questions? And I don't see anyone, any more questions here. Well, and if that's the case, I just want to take a moment to just thank you all for your time, for the thoughtfulness that you brought to this conversation. I know that I mentioned in a call with Prentice around like have my own practice and my own healing journey, and like working with so many elders and folks who are in the movement prior to coming into philanthropy and knowing how sacred this work is, and then coming into philanthropy and seeing the interest in healing justice and understanding the risks that come with introducing this work and just the complications of it. And so you all did just such a fantastic job of really highlighting the significance of this work, the connection to movement building and organizing, and the long journey ahead in terms of making sure that we now in philanthropy, have some guidelines and some recommendations that you all provided, and just a model in terms of what you provided, Kiyomi, your grounding, Prentice, and just all of it was just fantastic. Nicole, everything that you all present and that you do, I just want to thank you so much for all of your work and what you shared with us and brought with us today. I just have an immense sense of gratitude for all that you all do. So I just want to thank you again. To all the participants, on the call. Please, keep your ear out for our next session, our next education session, which will be focused on community organizing. Again, thank you all. Have a fantastic rest of your week. We'll be in touch soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.